Today's presentation will be given by Dr. Jennifer Montez. Dr. Montez is a professor of sociology in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University and is the director of Syracuse University's Center for Aging and Policy Studies. She earned her PhD in sociology right here at UT Austin and worked as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at Harvard following her graduation. Dr. Montez is a nationally recognized scholar of aging, health, and the life course. Her research focuses on drivers of growing inequalities in adult mortality across education levels, geographic areas, and policy contexts, combining her background in social demography with feminist geography approaches to investigate how state contexts shape gender differences in mortality. Dr. Montez's work has appeared in a number of prestigious publications, including Demography, Social Forces, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Population Research and Policy Review, and the American Journal of Public Health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Montez.
Well, thank you, Randy, for that really kind introduction, and thank you, Bridget, for the invitation to be a part of the seminar today. I have been looking forward to this for months. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. All right. Okay, fantastic. So the work that I'll present today, it's collaborative work with a very interdisciplinary group that I have been collaborating with for quite some time now, one of whom is Mark Hayward. So, and I understand from the conversations before this call that Mark has been promoting this work quite a bit. So, so maybe you've heard a little bit about what I'll present. So the motivation for this work is to understand the troubling trends in US life expectancy. So this is something that everybody here today is very familiar with. It's got a lot of press attention over the last 5 or 6 years and research attention as well. But the reality is this trouble started many, many decades ago. We typically pinpoint it to around 1980, when the US was rather average in life expectancy. We were never fantastic, but we were at least average. And then after the early 80s, gains in US life expectancy started falling behind gains that other high-income countries were making. And then around 2010, our gains just simply stopped. And around 2014, we started declining. And that's when people really started paying attention. So our group developed the hypothesis over the last couple of years that what's going on with US states, in particularly state level policies and the polarization of those policies, might have a pretty big role in explaining what's going on at the US level. So I will walk you through our hypothesis and the way that we've tested that. And I built this presentation into 3 main parts. So I want to spend about 15 minutes up front building this narrative that states are very important and increasingly important in shaping our health and might have contributed to the troubling trend in US life expectancy. Then I'll spend about another 15 minutes showing you some evidence from a recent study that Mark and I and others did to empirically examine the role of state policies on those trends. And then about 10 minutes at the end, delving deeper into some of the questions that this work raises and some of the limitations of the work. I'm anticipating the kinds of questions that you'll have at the end. And so I've just built that into the talk itself. All right, so we're not the first team to try to understand what's going on with US life expectancy. There's been a lot of work on this over the last decade or so. And some of the really important work has come out in a series of volumes sponsored by the National Academies of Science. And in those volumes, this panel of experts came up with 5 potential explanations for what might explain why the US is falling off the rails really in terms of life expectancy. And I've listed these 5 hypotheses here. And I've ordered them from the most structural macro level explanation at the top all the way down to the most micro level explanation at the bottom. And these, to be clear, these explanations are not considered competing. So the thinking is that all of these play some role. So what I want to give you now is my very stylized assessment of the literature on each of these 5 hypotheses. So it's not going to be a comprehensive review, but it will be reflective of the amount of attention that's given to each of these 5 and the strength of the evidence for each of these 5. So here's what we've focused on in the last 10 years or so in testing each of these 5 explanations. And if you're interested in all of the studies that have gone into this stylized review, I've got slides at the end that you're welcome to have. So I want to point out a couple of patterns, if you will, in this very stylized review. The first is that the bulk of the attention has been paid to individual behaviors. So what are Americans doing wrong? Why are they engaging in increasingly bad behaviors is kind of the thinking. And so what we've learned is that, at least in the early part of the US not keeping pace, so in the 80s and the 90s, smoking behaviors did play a role in Americans falling behind in their life expectancy. And more recently, the behaviors that seem to be playing a role are those related to external causes of death. So overdoses, suicides, homicides, and accidents. There's been a little evidence for physical activity or sedentary lifestyles or obesity. So the other pattern I want you to notice here is that as you move up from micro to macro, the attention that we've given in terms of our studies has become quite a bit thinner. So by the time we get to the policy environment, I can point to really just one study that has taken on the policy explanation. Now, to be clear, there's been a lot of work that's examined, the US policy environment versus other countries' policy environments as an explanation. But what we're talking about here is the trends. Trends in US policies contributed to trends in US life expectancy. So, and the last thing that I want to point out here is that there's not a lot of evidence. We don't have a really firm grasp on what's happening. It seems like some behaviors play a role, socioeconomic resources might play some role, higher levels of poverty, and the fact that low-educated US adults are doing particularly poorly compared to their counterparts in other parts of the world. So we wanted to kind of rebalance the focus and really take on this policy environment explanation. Might the US policy environment and changes in that environment over time played a role? So once you reach that point, then the next natural question is, what do we mean by policy environment and where do we start? Are we talking federal policy, state policy, local policy? So that's a pretty intimidating question. But luckily, we worked very closely in this project with a political scientist who has pointed us pretty firmly in the direction of state policies. And here's why. So according to our collaborator, who's Jacob Grumbach out at the University of Washington, the work that he's done, he's shown pretty convincingly that the policy environment under which we're all living here in the US is increasingly shaped by our state of residence. And that kind of concentration of policy environment at the state level has been driven by 2 major policy movements. One of those we often refer to as devolution. It's often tied to the early 1980s and the Reagan administration, and has been ramped up even more after the 1994 midterms. I mention this just to point out that there are these kind of like punctuated changes in how the policy environment has shifted in the US during this time period. So what devolution has done is it's transferred pretty pretty meaningful amount of federal policymaking authority down to the states. And one of the most prime examples of that is transitioning a lot of authority around social service funding and delivery to the states. The other policy movement that's been going on is called preemption. So what this movement has done is taken away local authority. And this is where states have been key actors. States have implemented what we call preemption laws that have removed local authority, so city and county authority, to legislate on a large number of issues, like raising the minimum wage or mandating paid leave or banning fracking, for example. So the consequence of these two policy movements is that states have been the benefactor of a lot of policymaking authority. So what does this look like? Can we actually see this increasing policymaking authority? Can we see what it's done? So we can. So this is a very messy figure, but all I really want you to focus on is the smoothed curves there. So what this shows is for every year from about 1800 to about present day, the rate at which states have been adopting new policies. So there is a general upward trend, 1800 till about 1980. The states have become more and more active in adopting new policies. But what you see in this post 1980 era is this exponential increase in the rate at which states are adopting new policies, right? Which is exactly the time frame when US life expectancy started falling behind. Okay, so just because states are legislating more doesn't necessarily imply anything about population health, but the ways that states have made policy, the way they've made policy decisions is important. And I'll show you graphically what states have done with this increasing level of policymaking activity. What they have done is that they have made decisions that have created policy contexts in states that are either increasingly liberal or increasingly conservative. And I'll show you this graphically. So this is again from our political scientist colleague who looked at all states across all years from 1970 to 2014 and looked at 136 different policies in every state and every year. And then developed a scale to identify or quantify how liberal or conservative a state was across all 136 policies in a given year. So what I'm showing you here is that the range in each year in states' policy orientations. So in 1970, states obviously were different in their policy orientation, they always are. But from the 70s down to 1981, you can see that states became more and more alike in their policy orientation. So the difference between a conservative orientation and a liberal orientation was converging. And then in 1981, we have this abrupt change and states start diverging in their policy orientation. They're becoming more and more dissimilar, more and more polarized. I'll show you another view of this polarization. This chart has an arrow for every state. I realize the vertical axis, the font is really small, but you don't need to worry about reading it. The key point here is that every state has an arrow. The start of the arrow indicates the state's policy orientation in 1970, and the end of the arrow is its orientation in 2014. So as you can see, the vast majority of states have moved away from the center. States that started liberal are now more liberal. They started conservative, they're now more conservative. Okay, so effectively what you just saw in the previous chart. But the benefit of this chart is that I can pick on some states, and I'm going to pick on Connecticut and Oklahoma. And I'll continue to do so throughout the presentation. So you can see here, Connecticut has moved much more liberal. Oklahoma has moved much more conservative. Okay, so that's a view of what's been happening with states and their policies. much more active in policymaking. They've polarized their overall policy environments into conservative buckets of policies or liberal buckets of policies. So can we find any descriptive evidence that the way states are polarized in their policies correspond at all with the way they have diverged in their life expectancies? So here what you're looking at are trends in life expectancy for all 50 states. So there's a gray line here, one for each state, starting in 1959, going until about present day. And I'll just highlight an interesting pattern here. So again, just like we saw with state policy orientations, life expectancy across states was also converging until the early 80s, and then it started diverging. We now have a larger difference in life expectancy across states than has ever been reported. And you can see here that there's a bottom group of states that have really just fallen off from the rest. There's a whole bottom group that has made very few gains in life expectancy since the 80s. Now, what's not happening here is that the states that have always been good are just better, and the states that have always been bad are just worse, okay? It's more complicated than that. In this chart, again, like I said, I'm gonna pick on Connecticut and Oklahoma. This chart illustrates that point. We have states that have moved in their ranking quite substantially. So in 1959, these states had the exact same life expectancy. Fast forward to present day, Connecticut is among the top 5, Oklahoma is among the bottom 5. There's a lot of dynamic activity going on at the state level, both in terms of policy orientation and in life expectancy. So the last slide I want to show you before I get into the study that we conducted on this is to put these two pieces together. So I'm going to go back to this chart where, again, this gray line is showing the range in policy orientation between states in every year. I'm going to overlay on this chart the range in life expectancy for each state, across each state in each year. And you see this really compelling correlation between the two. So as states were converging in their policy orientation to 1981, and we have this abrupt change and they're diverging in their policy orientation, we see something very similar with life expectancy. 3 years later, in 1984, states start diverging. So what all of this first section is to say is to hopefully convince you that there's something going on with the states. They're very active in terms of their policy orientation, and they're diverging in a way that parallels really closely the way that life expectancy is moving across states. So that led us to the current study, which was to see if we can generate some pretty compelling empirical evidence that these changes in state policies are actually causing, to the extent we can, causing these troubling trends with US life expectancy. So how did we do that? So we took the life expectancy for every state from the Berkeley database. So we have a life expectancy for every state for every year from 1970 to 2014. Why those years? Because those are the years that we have the state policy data. The state policy data, we have 18 measures of state policies. These are measures that are derived from a much larger set of 135 policies and measures that were created by Jacob Grumbach. So let me give you an example of how this works. So let me take the private sector labor policy. So that's in the second column, third one down. So what Jacob did was identify among the whole set of 135 policies, there are a number of them that all relate to private sector labor issues. So minimum wage, unemployment insurance, right to work laws, etc. So we looked at all of those policies for every state and created a private sector labor score. where each state is given a score from 0 to 1 in every year, where 1 means the state has a very conservative configuration of those policies. So low minimum wage, they have right to work laws, they've banned paid leave, for example. Sorry, that is 0 means it's a conservative policy. So 1, it has the most liberal configuration of those policies. So a high minimum wage, no right to work laws, and maybe they have mandated paid leave, for example, okay? So that's to say that all 18 of these measures are scored on a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 means a state has a very conservative configuration of policies on that domain. 1 means it has a very liberal configuration of policies. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to talk more about it at the end. Okay, so then the second challenge with doing this work was, how do we operationalize time? Because as you saw, these trends in US life expectancy and life expectancy across states, they're non-linear. So we took the approach of using join point regression models, which are becoming increasingly popular in this line of work, to identify linear time segments. So the way these join point regression models work is that they look for segments of time where the slope is consistent and linear. And then a join point means that the slope has significantly changed and you have a new slope for a certain period of time until it has a significant change, and et cetera. So you can see here, this is showing the trend for female life expectancy for the US. And we have 5 join points here, are these 6 linear segments of time. We thought that this was a preferred approach also for substantive reasons, because there are, like I said earlier, these punctuated moments in this post-1980 period where there were policy shifts, and we wanted to see if empirically these models could draw out those punctuated periods, and they do pretty well. Okay, so the modeling approach is this. So we're going to regress life expectancy for women, those 6 time segments, for men the 5, and our 18 state policy domains. We include fixed effects for states so that we can account for stable differences between states. We adjust for auto and spatial correlation. We adjust for the percentage of the state's population that are immigrants in any given year, because we know immigrants tend to have a higher life expectancy than US born individuals. And I'll just mention now that we did a lot of supplementary analyses. We did our best to really torture these models and see how robust they were. They're very robust. We did things like forgot the splines altogether and just include fixed effects for every year. We included quadratics for the policy measures. We examined unemployment as a confounder. We conducted some placebo tests, and the results hold, but I'm happy to talk about all of those analyses later. Okay, so on to the results. So the first question that we asked was just quite simply, do state policies predict life expectancy? So here the short answer is yes, but it's more interesting than just a yes. So here's the results, and I'm just going to focus on the results for women in the interest of time. So here's what we did. So pay attention to this light gray diamond. So the first thing we did was say, let's examine one policy at a time. So let's see if the private labor policy domain predicts life expectancy, including everything else, the fixed effects for states, the percent immigrant populations, et cetera, but not including any other policies. So let's just examine the private labor policy. And so what that model tells us, or suggests, is that if a state were to move from the most conservative configuration of labor policies to the most liberal configuration of state policies, right? So the policy score is going from 0 to 1, that we would expect life expectancy within that state to increase by 3 years, which is really large. And then we repeated the same exercise for all the other 17 policies. Okay, so that's kind of informative. However, we know that policies, their liberalism, they correlate. So states that have more liberal labor policies also tend to have more liberal environment policies and civil rights policies, etc. So our next step then was to estimate a single model with all 18 policy measures. And you can see that now we find, for example, that if a state were to move from the most conservative configuration of labor policies to the most liberal configuration of labor policies, we would expect life expectancy in that state to increase by 1 year, which is still really large. So the vertical red line there is to distinguish policies which a more liberal version tends to predict longer life expectancy. So those are all of the red diamonds to the right of the line, and policies that tend to predict longer life expectancy when they're conservative. And those are the red dots to the left of the line. And you can see which policies get the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. So labor policies tend to be really important, right? Moving life expectancy by potentially a year. Tobacco policies, environment policies, immigration, civil rights, gun control, abortion. Okay. So the next question we asked then was, okay, so now that we've seen that state policies do predict life expectancy, and some have a very strong relationship with life expectancy, could we change US life expectancy by turning the knobs on state policies? By how much could we change US life expectancy through state policies? These are some hypothetical examples here. The first thing we said was, what if we didn't do anything? What if we just let policies just move how they're moving now? So if we didn't intervene, what do we think will happen with US life expectancy, which is total hands-off approach? So in other words, we know, for example, the abortion policies are moving more conservative. So we said, what if we just let them go maximum conservative? So a score of 1. We know that environmental policies are moving liberal. Okay, let's just continue that and assume environmental policies will end up with a score for the most liberal. So this is our status quo scenario. And we estimate this we'll see very little improvement in life expectancy with just this kind of hands off, let's let everything just move how it's moving. So we estimate about a 0.4 year increase for women and a 0.3 year increase for men. Then we really started playing around and said, all right, what if we gave all 18 policy scores? What if we move them all to the most liberal configuration and we had all states do that? So we estimate US life expectancy would increase, it's remarkable, 2.8 years. That's a very large jump, 2.8 years for women and 2.1 years for men. On the flip side, if we said, let's move all of those 18 state policies to the maximum conservative configuration, we estimate that we would lose about 2 years in life expectancy. So those two scenarios, unrealistic. But we can go in and predict what would happen with using more realistic scenarios. For one, suppose all states implemented or mimicked the policy environment of Connecticut. Even mimicking a state policy environment that we have an example of, okay, it's a real example, we could still potentially see a very large increase in life expectancy. So 2 years increase for women and a 1.3 year increase for men. And we did the same thing with Oklahoma, and we would expect to see US life expectancy decline. Okay, so the main takeaway from this slide is that tweaking US policies could have a really substantial impact on US life expectancy. All right. So now to the last question that we addressed, and this is really the question that we wanted to answer in the first place, which is, have those trends in state policies contributed to the trends in US life expectancy? Is there a real relationship? And we did this by simply, or we tried to answer this by simply estimating the model with policies and without the policies, and paying attention to how these time coefficients differed, okay? So how does this time coefficient differ when we have the policies in the model versus when we don't? And here's what we find. I'm going to walk you through the results here for women on the left. So we find that in that first time period, that 1970 to 1980, linear period of time, that the way that state policies were changing was, on the whole, positive for US life expectancy. So that whatever changes that might have been happening that might hurt life expectancy, those are more than offset by changes that improved life expectancy. And that the positive slope in US life expectancy, we can attribute 3.1% of that slope to this overall positive effect of state policies. But then you see in 1979 and 1991, the second time period, on the whole, state policies were detrimental for US life expectancy for women. So that whatever changes that were happening that were good for life expectancy were more than offset by those that were bad. And the way to interpret this, again, this 11, is that the US life expectancy slope for women would have been 11% steeper had state policies not changed the way they did during that period. This middle period, there's the good and the bad net out, and then we have a more positive period here and a remarkably negative period here. So in the last 5 years of the study, women's life expectancy slope would have been 25% steeper had state policies not changed the way that they did. So really, if you look at the bars above the line, those are periods when state policies were doing good things for life expectancy, and the bars below are when states are doing bad things. And if we look across the 45-year period, on the whole, state policies were not doing us any favors in terms of life expectancy. Okay, so the conclusions from this part of the presentation is that when we think about what's going on with the US life expectancy trend, that it's a lot more interesting when we look at what's going on with trends in state life expectancy. It's a very dynamic, very divergent environment at the state level. We think that it provides some pretty compelling evidence that the changes in state policies and the importance of states has contributed to the troubling trends in US life expectancy. And we can also point out some policies that seem to be heavy hitters in terms of contributing to these trends. Okay, so the last section I wanted to discuss some limitations, and I anticipate some of the questions that you might have about this work. So I wanted to come prepared with some possible answers. Okay, so one of the questions I often get when I talk about this work is, okay, how do state policies affect life expectancy? What are the mechanisms? How does this all play out? My answer to that is that I don't really have a good answer. For some policies, I think it's pretty clear. So tobacco policy, I think it's pretty clear how that filters down and shapes people's life expectancy. For other policies, it's not very clear to me. Voting policies, for example, what are the mechanisms through which voting policy might shape life expectancy? I don't have a good handle on that. From the evidence that we do have on state policies, it seems like the mechanisms are really complex. And I'm just giving an example here of minimum wage policy, and this is one of the key policies in the labor domain. We know from prior work that minimum wage has unintended effects on health. Increases in minimum wage reduce teenage pregnancy, they reduce smoking, they reduce obesity, they reduce infant mortality, they reduce having a low weight birth. These birth outcomes then proceed to affect the next generation's health and longevity. So the point here that I want to make is that we don't have a very good handle on how all of those 18 domains, or the ones that were important, how they actually shape life expectancy. We have a lot more work to do to see how that filters, but I suspect that the mechanisms are complex and probably surprising and unintended. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about threats to causality. So I like to think that we've done a pretty good job at developing some compelling estimates and can maybe talk about causality with a small c, but there are some threats that we need to be clear about. So one of the possibilities is that, well, economic conditions differ across the states. They fluctuate across the states. And this is absolutely true. And we know that things like unemployment rate in a state predicts mortality in a state. So in our supplementary analyses, we adjusted for unemployment rates across each state and year, and our results are robust. So why are these in supplementary analyses? That's because the state level data on unemployment only begins in 1976. And we didn't want to shorten the data set for our main analyses by including unemployment in everything. Okay. Another question that I get is, okay, states might matter, but populations in some states, they're different, right? There's compositional differences. Populations in some states are less educated, they're poorer than others, and couldn't that be part of the story? So yes, of course, potentially. So, but keep in mind that our models did adjust for stable differences between states. So the fact that the population of Mississippi is consistently less educated than the population of Minnesota is to some extent taken into account in the models. But more importantly, just conceptually, I like to think about compositional factors as being a pathway through which states shape our health. And I'll use education as an example here. So the educational attainment of a state is sometimes considered a compositional characteristic. So maybe that state has a low, high life expectancy because their population has a higher level of education. Another way to think about education is that it's also a compositional characteristic. It's also tied to the state of residence, because states through funding, school funding, and other various mechanisms can influence overall levels of education. And through other kinds of state policies like minimum wage, EITC, Medicaid, they also influence the risk of having low levels of education for mortality. So this is all to say that we have more work to do to take into account compositional differences, but to keep in mind that it's very difficult to separate composition and context. Okay, other factors may also matter. Yes, so we can't account for within state variation. We don't have the ability to do that in this particular data set, but that's something that we absolutely want to do going forward. I mean, it may very well be the case that states have their largest effect on urban populations or rural populations. We just don't know. And the last threat to causality that I'll mention is interstate migration. And it's kind of the Achilles heel of this work, right? People move, and generally healthier people move across state lines than less healthy people. So in this data set, we don't have a good way to take that into account. At the same time, it likely contributes, but I don't think that it explains away our results. And here's why. During the same time that life expectancy was going like this between states, it's diverging, interstate migration rates were plummeting. Okay, they've been declining since the middle of the 20th century, and they've declined further in half since 1980. We've done some other work where we can take into account interstate migration. So if we, for example, use some other data sets where we can only examine people who don't move across state lines, we find very similar patterns. The states that are unhealthy when we include all population or everybody are also the most unhealthy when we include only the people that have lived there their whole lives. And the same thing when we look at mortality trends, that we see very similar trends when we look at the whole population than when we look at those who have stayed. Okay. And I just want to show you some charts that I think are really fascinating about migration. So this chart, and I didn't want that box to pop up. So what you're looking at here, the horizontal axis is time. So the chart starts in 1900, it ends in 2012. And for every year, what it does is it shows the proportion of the population in Connecticut that it shows where they were born. Okay, so in 1900, 57% of the people born in Connecticut, 57% of the people living in Connecticut were born in Connecticut. 26% of the people living in Connecticut were born outside the US. But if you look over 1970 and beyond, which is the time period that we study, there's just not been a lot of change in the composition of the population in Connecticut. And the same thing is true when we look at the population of Oklahoma. So I think, you know, when we worry about the effect of interstate migration on these estimates, and we should, right? I mean, to be careful, we really do need to think about this, but I think our fear is perhaps greater than is necessary. I think that when we think about migration, we're thinking about, for example, what was going on in Oklahoma in 1900, 1910, 1920, where we have this pretty significant churning of the population in and out of the state. The period that we're looking at here in our results, there's a lot of stability in states' populations. Okay, so my last slide here, I'll just touch on some implications and next steps. So I think what our this project and other projects like it that we've done are suggesting is that we need to pay more attention to the political, legal, and commercial determinants of health. I didn't touch on the commercial aspect today, but I can in the Q&A if you want. And I've included in here a couple of quotes from Claire Bambara, whose work is amazing on this topic, who is reminding us that to properly understand the U.S. mortality advantage, we really need to quote unquote scale up and focus on these upstream political, economic, and policy drivers, because these are, as she says, the causes of the causes of the causes of what's going on. So where are we going next with this work? We're currently extending it to examine specific causes of death. This will help us get a better handle on some of those mechanisms. Are these effects happening through, let's say, cardiovascular mortality or homicide mortality? Where are we seeing these effects play out? We're also examining heterogeneity across population subgroups. So we've just finished some work where we've examined these effects across sex, race, educational attainment. So we're in this current phase of work, trying to get some more granularity on how these processes are playing out and who's being most affected. So I will stop there and say I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Jennifer, for an absolutely fascinating and important talk. And so now we are going to open up for questions. Just a reminder that the first two questions will be asked by graduate students before opening the floor up to the rest of the audience. So just a reminder, please unmute yourself. And at this point, we'll just let people jump in, graduate students first, and look forward to an interesting discussion. And also feel free to use the chat too. I'll be keeping up with the chat as well.
I was wondering, Dr. Montez, if you and your team have looked at all at how individual policies might contribute to gender or racial disparities. So like, for example, like differences in tobacco taxes or voting differently affect different groups, or is that something you're trying to look at down the line?
So that's a great question, Randy. So the answer is yes, we are moving in that direction. And in fact, I just had a conversation with our political scientist colleague a few days ago about this very topic. We are embarking on really just downloading existing individual state level policy data from this fantastic database that's available at Michigan State. So we've hesitated to do that at this point, or to this point, because I wasn't quite sure how to handle 200, 300 policies at once. So we've added a new team member who is a biostatistician and machine learning expert who can help us handle, this kind of large data exercise, bringing in all the individual policies. But I mean, quite frankly, we have to move in this direction because it's not enough to say that environmental policies matter a lot. Well, what does that mean? And if we were to talk to a state legislator, I think they're going to want something a little bit more concrete than that. Can we give them an idea on which of those environmental policies might be the most important? So we are moving in that direction.
Hi, I'm Jenna. I had a question when you were talking about the configurations for the different states on their policies. You had that list of all the buckets, and they were giving us more 0 to 1, like more liberal to conservative. I'm just curious specifically how that was decided. Like, did you go through and like count how many liberal versus conservative policies were enacted within a year? Because I think you mentioned it was like more or less, but I'm just trying to figure out like specifically, I guess, what that means, like quantitatively, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a great question. So, so the way that, so my understanding is that the way that Jacob did this depends a bit on the policy itself. So let's take minimum wage, for example. So minimum wage it's a continuous measure. So he would scale minimum wage across the whole time period. And the state that had the lowest minimum wage, whatever the lowest minimum wage is, that's equal to a 0. And the highest minimum wage is a 1, because low minimum wage we would consider conservative, and a high minimum wage we would consider a 1. So he's basically just taking the continuous measure and normalizing it. For other policies that are dichotomous, so for example, marijuana policy. So he would take a state, and if in a particular year the state decriminalized marijuana policy, it would get a 1, because you either decriminalize it or you don't. So in a state that did not do it would get a 0. So in those cases, there's just a 0 and 1 and nothing else in between. So you did that for each of the policies and then put them in the groups, and then created this sum score of the 0s and 1s and everything in between, to come up with a score for each domain.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. It took me many months and many conversations with Jacob to wrap my head around how he had created those domains.
It sounds like a lot of work.
Yes, I think it was a lot of work. I've tried to convince him to extend his policy domains to present day, and I was told emphatically no, that it took him his entire graduate career to develop the policy database, and then he could not extend it further, which is understandable.
Hello,
Mark.
Sorry.
I was going to say Mark had his hand up.
Hi, Jennifer. I was just wondering, first a comment. One of the things that you showed was that some of these policies have really broad effects across the life course, which is a pretty interesting thing considering that's probably what it would take to alter life expectancy so much. So I thought that was a really important finding that you were showing. The other thing is I have a question about how you think about the migration issue. Have you looked carefully at who is moving by education level? So I'm thinking back to the work that we've done on the fact that the low educated people are the most vulnerable to policies in terms of their health. If well-educated people are the least vulnerable, but they're also the most likely to move, maybe that migration issue is not really salient. I didn't know what you had looked at the migration groups.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So I have not looked at the migration groups. My understanding from the literature on this is that people with higher levels of education are more likely to move across state lines than people with less education. Although people with less education are more likely to move, they're moving in a smaller geographic area. So I think that you're right. I think that, it's almost like compounding disadvantage. If you have lower levels of education and you're more vulnerable to the state environment that you're in, it's a double whammy if you're living in a state that has policies that just with a very weak social safety net. And we see this in some of the other work that we've done where we've been able to just look at individuals who reside in the state that they were born in. So we're assuming they're non-movers, and we can look at those with a college education or more, and their mortality, their disability, it looks really similar across the states, right? It almost doesn't matter where they live. I mean, in really remarkably different contexts too. Having a college degree is almost just as protective in Mississippi as it is in Minnesota, which is just difficult to wrap your head around. But if you have low levels of education, it matters so much where you live.
Asia, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, hello. My name is Asya. I'm a first-year student. It was a nice talk. Thank you. My question was, did you look at the working hours as a private labor policy? I was wondering that, and if you have any results about like working hours. And also, I was wondering, like, if you take the all 18 different public policies as equal, does it make sense? Yeah, my question.
Yeah, so I don't have, let me check if there was, yeah, so in his list of labor policies, there's nothing in here that would give us a handle on policies around working hours, unfortunately. And to answer your question, we did actually, treat these 18 policies as potentially equal in their creation and in their and in the models. And so I hope that we can do better going forward. This is another reason why we invited this particular biostatistician and machine scientist onto the teams, because it is possible to create these policy scores that weight the policies that have a stronger relation to the outcome variable, to weight them more, so we don't have to consider all policies being equally important. So that's a refinement that we will make going forward. Thank you for your question.
Before we let Ken and Peter go, there was 2 questions in the chat. One from Christy Wood. She said, fantastic talk. Curious what you predict conservative leaning legislation makers would say to this overall trend.
I'm not sure. So this paper. So we published the paper in October, and it got a lot of coverage, but it got very friendly coverage, and that it disappointed me a bit because I think that it didn't reach some folks whose minds I would like to change about the policy environment, right? So those state legislators who, really hope that they would raise the minimum wage, for example. So luckily, next month, I am giving a talk to a group of 30 state legislators. This is the Milbank Fund has organized this talk, and this group comes from both sides of the aisle. So I am very interested to see if the reactions from this group, fall across party lines, or if, or maybe not. So it's a good question. I just saw Kelly Rayleigh mention that there are some hands up, and I apologize. I've seen the hands up, and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be calling on folks.
Yeah, Ken's hand was up first if he wants to go.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I really enjoy it, and I'm also very glad to have you to give this talk. I have two questions. The first one would be about the relationship between the policy. So did you model it as contemporaneous? And if so, how do we think about the contemporaneous relationship? Because I assume, during COVID time, I can see how policy will have very immediate effect on mortality. But in the long run, I'm having some problems to wrap my mind around it. The second question I have is obviously, you already talked about it in the causality threat. But I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are curious about which factors you think might simultaneously determine policy and mortality. Thank you.
Good questions. So about the timing issue. So we did, in some of our supplementary analyses, we tried lagging the policies. We did a 2-year lag and a 5-year lag. Results were robust. We stopped at 5 years because the correlational structure of the data changes over time because the policies are changing over time. So if we were to find, for example, if we lagged it by 15 years, if we found a difference, it's actually not clear whether that difference muddied the waters or clarified things. So we tried to be pretty conservative in our lag, just a 2- and a 5-year lag. I think that for some policies, that's okay to look at them contemporaneously. Minimum wage policy, for example, we know that minimum wage policy, I shouldn't say we know, that there's strong evidence that minimum wage policy affects birth outcomes, for example. So there can be pretty immediate effects to minimum wage policy. Other examples, it's not so clear. One that bothers me is education. So what does our education policy measure mean for life expectancy for adults, 30 and beyond? That's not clear to me. And so this is an issue that we're aware of, and I don't have a really good answer for. But I guess the short answer is to say for some policies, we're not so concerned about that, and for others, we are. So your other question was about a third factor, right? A confounding factor. I've started to think about this a little bit more with another group that I'm working with. And that group thinks a lot about income inequality. And we're exploring the idea that income inequality might shape both the policy and the life expectancy. But at the moment, that's the one, quote unquote, third factor that we have been thinking about.
Thank you.
So I hate to interrupt, but we are at time and we need to wrap up. However, if people have more questions, we can stay on for a little bit longer, but I just want people to have the opportunity to leave if they need to.
I had a quick question. Well, first, I really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was very interesting looking at state level changes. I was actually, Ken borrowed the first question that I was going to ask about the lagging. That was something that I was thinking. It was modeling contemporaneous effects. That was interesting. Did you what kind of supplementary work have you done looking at states that are somewhat securely seated in their political ideology versus those states that are more like swing states and, you know, variable in, you know, which direction any given election might run? Because I imagine that those, you know, more volatile states, you know, you could see dramatic policy changes from one regime to the next. It'd be very dramatic, whereas other states, they're just kind of canalized in one direction. You know, you might see differences across that. And so I was wondering if you had looked at that.
Thanks, Peter. I haven't looked at it. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I would have even thought about that idea until about a month ago. I came across this article, and I apologize right now, I'm completely blanking on the author. But the study had found that when the political party changes, that mortality of people that affiliate with the losing party increases. And I think that is so fascinating. And I think it kind of goes to your question, right? So if there are states that might be, you know, red one time, blue one time, and, you know, there's a lot of swapping. I mean, you know, perhaps that is elevating mortality in those states some way. I don't know. I mean, it's a thought that I've only recently considered. So I think that there's some interesting work that could be done on that. Do you have any thoughts on that? I think that it would, those states that are, you know, purple and, you know, go back and forth, you know, do you think that they would have elevated mortality?
Yeah, I wonder what the size of the effect that you're talking about would be, because that, especially in those states that are more volatile, like that would be pretty dramatic if that effect kind of stuck around. If it was a, you know, dramatic shift in a state that had been stable for a long time, I could maybe see something there. But yeah, no, I'm just thinking about like political ideology and volatility, and it's I don't know, it's a curious aspect that just kind of dawned on me.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think that we might be able to get better traction on that if we had data at lower levels of geography even.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to be cognizant of Jennifer's time too. And I don't know if other people have any other questions, but I think that this might be a good time to wrap it up. And thank you so much, Jennifer, for giving us this important presentation today and kicking off our spring. So thank you.